in our book of joys and concerns. There are quite a few entries. This one is not signed, but it says, I am in pain that non-binary and trans people are being blamed for the recent disasters like California fires and the DC plane crash. Resist, love, stay strong against the hate. Indeed. And Nathan shares a joy. Our you guy got a biopsy done on a mole on his back recently. It's not of concern, no cancer. And here's one for today, which is Groundhog Day. It says, hopefully nobody has to relive today endlessly. And here's one that reads, it's a concern. A friend was recently in a car accident. She isn't in too bad of a shape, but still wants us to pray for her recovery out of the hospital. Yes. And a concern, a sorrow. Condolences to all the families of the beautiful and talented skaters who lost their life in the plane crash. While so many concerns were shared here, there are many that are not shared in writing and cannot even be formulated in words, but we hold them in our hearts. Even though 2 fires have been controlled in California now, there are many more fires. The catastrophic accident in Washington, D.C. at the Reagan Airport. It's one that touches us. And there is continuing suffering and human rights violations in places like Gaza, the Ukraine, and other locations around the world. Let's hold a few moments of silence for these. The candidate was asked whether there is a universal right to health care. The candidate answered that they could not give a yes or no answer, thus implying that their answer was no. While that answer was not too surprising to me, it certainly was deplorable for a wealthy nation such as the United States. By comparison, as of the last count in 2024, 72 countries out of the 195 have universal health care, giving all citizens access to healthcare services either at no cost or at low cost. That comprises more than 2/3 of the world's population, actually 69% if you're into numbers. 69% of the people. They live in Europe, in Asia, in Africa, in the Americas, in Australia. I grew up in a country that is on the list. But even there, access to health care was not always perfect. It was a work in progress over the past decades. And here's a little story, a personal story of such imperfection. This happened in Belgium. When I lived there and I was little, I had what you might call a near-death experience. I was 4. I remember being on the patio outside our kitchen window. My mother was always sending the kids outside so that she could have peace inside the house. But I was standing there crying because I had terrible back pain. And eventually I was let in. And I don't remember much else after that, apart from a few intermittent memories. Eventually, the doctor came. This all happened at a time when physicians still made house calls. He shook his head, which is never a good sign coming from a medical doctor. And he explained the situation to my parents. I had double pneumonia and I was dying. Now, as it turns out, my father always had his nose buried in the newspaper. And he had just read something exciting in that newspaper. Thank goodness for his habit of being buried in that paper for hours on end every evening. He had read that there was a new drug called penicillin, and that had just become available commercially. And that this drug could cure things like pneumonia and pleurisy and the combination of these things that I was suffering from. He triumphantly told the doctor about it, but that guy again shook his head, and this time more vehemently. Oh no, he explained, that would not be possible. Penicillin is not for you, meaning of course not for me, who was nearing death. And to the obvious question, why not? He might have added an expletive, but I cannot repeat that here. The doctor replied that this drug is expensive and can only be afforded by wealthy people, and therefore he had not mentioned it as an option. Even though the country at that time already had a national healthcare system, apparently not all medications were readily available to everyone. My father became angry, and he imperiously declared that he and my mother would pay for the drug up front and that it had to be administered right away. I know they must have committed everything they had to pay for this treatment, and I'm still grateful. Long story short, the doctor obtained penicillin, administered the dose, and by the next day I was not only conscious, I was hungry. Would that all small children who suffer from a treatable illness could recover like I did. But the reality is far from it. And here are some more sad statistics. The richest Americans live 10 to 15 years longer than the poorest. That is a huge gap in life expectancy. And what's worse, this so-called poverty gap has been getting bigger. It is getting bigger. We are on what is called a dollars or death public health trajectory. This is not a realistic time to ask if we can fix this problem right away by installing Medicare for all as a healthcare policy. That would help. But there is actually more to the difference in lifespans than just health insurance and health care. What else is going on with those of us who are poor, those who are very poor? For one thing, many suffer from chronic, persistent poverty that brings with it a host of other health-related issues. And here are just a few. We can talk about them for hours. Dangerous work conditions, low wages, and therefore unhealthy diets, unhealthy housing, soaring college debt for those who can go to college, depression, stress, despair, no vacation days, no paid parental leave, no nationalized daycare. Many people who are poor are actually forced to use an ultimate solution. And in the United States, that's the Plasma Donation Center. How many of you knew that? It's not very well known. Yeah, when I volunteered in a shelter for the unhoused recently, I often saw clients returning from a plasma center with a telltale bandage on their arm. One of the largest and most lucrative businesses in the United States, plasma centers provide the quickest way for poor people to make money if they're strapped for cash. The United States actually is the world's greatest exporter of plasma. And that resource is mostly provided by its poorest citizens. That means that the owners of plasma centers are getting rich because people at the bottom of the social ladder are exploited. This is obviously unjust. It is unconscionable. What then are the solutions? What can we do? Yeah, many possible solutions sponsored by federal governments typically are currently in limbo. Medicare for all, a federal minimum wage that is truly a living wage. In fact, there's talk about lowering the minimum wage at this time. College debt forgiveness, an extensively subsidized college tuition, affordable and safe housing, support for collective bargaining power. And that's not an exhaustive list, it's just a few of the things that would be tied to solutions. Eventually, we may be able to resolve these issues via the ballot box and be a nation that values all of its population, with living wages and public health care for all. What can we do individually right now? For one thing, when seeing somebody with needle marks on the inside of their arms, let's remember that these may be the result not from drug abuse, but from plasma center visits. In thinking further about what I can and should do, I was reminded again of Martin Luther King. When he spoke, and this was a long time ago, but still very relevant, his speech of March 25th, 1966, he gave this speech in Chicago at a press conference before his larger speech at the second convention of the Medical Committee for Human Rights, the MCHR. And he said, and this is a quote, "Of all the forms of inequality, injustice in health is the most shocking and the most inhuman because it so often results in physical death." And in this sentence, he said health, not health care, because he was referring to all those other aspects of chronic poverty that I just listed. And he called this injustice inhuman, which is worse than inhumane. I'm reminded of a day a couple of years ago when I had an accident in Glasgow, Scotland, and I broke my arm. When the ambulance showed up, it was my right arm too, but I was trying to use my left arm to whip out my health insurance card and to show them I have insurance. Yeah. The medics just laughed at me, or with me, and they told me to just put that card away. And they said, we want to help you because you are a human being, not because you have health insurance. Not to help would be inhuman, they said. And I was at the Glasgow National Health Service, which is so often criticized, but I had a very good experience there, even though I was there for hours. And this was before I was going to do a hike across Scotland, but I went anyway, with my arm in a sling and with Motrin in my baggage. Yeah. So this is what's being asked from us individually, to be human, to open our hearts, to see someone's woe and feel their pain, their sorrow, and to want to help. This opening of our hearts will lead us to support both individual acts of helpfulness, like giving kindness and participating in crowdfunding to pay for medication or a hospital bill, and also in promoting legislation designed to help us get a more human health and healthcare policy. That legislation will come down the pike. Again, I might say. So if we are ever asked if there is a universal right to healthcare, may we reply, yes. And if we are asked if there is a universal right to health, may we also reply, yes. As we heard in today's anthem, no one stands alone. Standing side by side, draw the circle wide. Let us resolve to make it so. And now please rise in body or spirit for our closing hymn, which is number 1017, 1017, Building a New Way. It is in the Teal hymnal number 1017.